Good morning, everybody. I'd like to thank Chobi Mela for this invitation. I'd like to thank Tanzim, Shahidul, and all the team. It was a great honor for me to come here. First time I'm in Dhaka, first time in Chobi Mela, and I'm deeply impressed with what you've done. I would also like to thank Pfrunder for organizing my trip to Bangladesh. And before I came here and we had this discussion, what should I present? I felt in the beginning a little uncomfortable because the situation in our countries are so different. Coming from Switzerland, from a rich country, with totally different conditions regarding infrastructure, regarding funding, regarding the freedom of expression, activism, government support, education system, regarding also the climate for preservation of archives. So many differences. So what can I tell you? But then I thought maybe it's just good to talk about my experiences. Our institution is like 50 years old now, founded in 1971. And in the end, we all have the same questions if we talk about the truth in the archive. And that's what I want to talk about today. I will give you a few examples how we work and discuss the problem of authenticity of truth in the archives. So, to start with a few reflections on the archive in general is maybe helpful. When I started to work in my institution, the Photosystem Schweiz, about 20 years ago, the topic of the archive was considered boring, a dry subject for specialists. The cultural and political significance of archives had not yet been much discussed among curators and artists, even in the archives themselves. Today, things are quite different. Archives have moved to the center of interest. Art projects and exhibitions with archives are omnipresent in the global art world, and not always in a satisfying way, because it seems that today one can do anything with archives. As a side effect, the term archive is used in a very broad sense today, far from its original meaning. In ancient times, it used to be a kind of control instrument that served to preserve state rule. Nowadays, the term archive is not only used for those government institutions. Private collections with a specific focus are also called archives if they are organized in a systematic way. In fact, the distinction between an archive and a collection is blurred. A collection of Swiss mountain pictures, the way you see it here, from different periods will be called an archive without hesitation if the collection contains enough items to create different groups and categories. But why are archives so attractive in our time? What is the use of such a storage of information and images? What do we expect to gain from it? Is it about documenting the past and securing evidence? Is it to prove how it really was? Is the archive a time machine with which we can travel into the past? Does an archive offer any help for orientation in the present and the future? To what extent is our approach to an archive guided by our current desires and questions? Could it be that working with archives is like looking in a mirror and that we see nothing but our own time and ourselves? In my talk, I will try to explore such questions with some case studies. They are not spectacular cases. They are rather examples of simple ways of our everyday activities with our archives. Before we look at these examples, however, I would like to give you a small insight into our institution, which, as Tanzim has mentioned, holds an extensive number of photo archives. The Photosystem is a private, non-profit foundation with a strong public presence and visibility. Most people consider it to be simply a venue for exhibitions. All the more so as we work together with a partner institution, the Photo Museum Winterthur, which is also well known as a place for exhibitions. Some 15 years ago, these two independent institutions jointly realized a Center for Photography, while our partner institution, Photo Museum, concentrates on the organization of exhibitions. The Photosystem is a hybrid enterprise. It is an exhibition venue, a research center, a service provider, an event location, and a reference institution for the preservation, documentation, and promotion of Swiss photographers, all in one. As already mentioned, the most visible part of the Photosystem is its gallery, visited by around 30,000 people each year. Here, a classical presentation of historical photographs. Sometimes this space looks quite different. Just a few days ago, we opened a new exhibition by Salvatore Vitale, who just arrived yesterday, by the way, here in Dhaka, and he gives a workshop right now. His show is under the title How to Secure a Country, with a total transformation of the gallery. But just as important as the visible part is our large non-public area in which we store the archives of photographers. The combination of archival and exhibition practice has shaped our institution from the very beginning in 1971, when it was founded in Zurich by a small circle of photo experts. Even then, its primary goal was to secure the archives of important photographers in order to pay tribute to the country's rich photographic tradition and culture. Over the past 50 years, the Photosystem has taken over some 80 archives. As a complement, a collection of important individual photographs and groups of works has been compiled, providing an overview over the history of photography in Switzerland from its beginning to the present. To this day, however, the archives form the backbone and the core of the foundation. This is precisely what distinguishes it from other collections. What does it mean to secure an individual archive? Firstly, it means that we do not only collect selected masterpieces from a photographer. We also collect the raw materials and the documents, intermediate stages and side shoots of our work. These can be negatives, work prints, media, clippings, contact sheets, or written documents such as diaries and notes, at least in the case of archives from the analog era. But why do we collect all this? Because, more generally speaking, we understand photography as a subjective expression of an individual photographer. In the archive, the various products related to the production of the photographic works remain connected. They are all part of the same spiritual universe. The production processes and the underlying intentions can be traced, as well as the original usage of the images, be it commissioned photography or personal projects. The archives allows us to reevaluate the work over time and to prevent it from some kind of petrification based on a limited number of icons. When we decide to take over an archive, we usually conclude a contract with the photographer, or hers, in which he assigns us the copyright for the time after his death and defines the rules as to what may and may not be done with his work. Only in this way can we assume long-term responsibility for an archive and look after it in the interests of its creator. In most cases, the archives are donated to our institution, to our foundation, after negotiations and explanation of our services. An archive that comes into our foundation is first viewed and sorted. We separate the exhibition prints or authorized work from the other parts of the archive, if such work exists at all. Some archives consist only of negatives. The nicely printed and authorized works are treated privileged. We classify and secure them physically according to conservation standards, for instance, acid-free boxes. We digitize them and upload the files in a database. For the long-term preservation of the high-quality prints, we have set up climatized rooms, one for black and white photography and one for color photography. And most important, as you know, is a stable, cool climate. The other parts of the archive are reorganized, cleaned of unimportant and harmful elements, and stored in a proper way. A rather new element in the process of preservation is the digitization of negatives. For about 2 years now, we have begun not only to digitally reproduce the collection of prints, but also to digitize selected negative holdings in very high resolution. We do not scan the negatives with a scanner, but digitize them with a digital camera. The result is not just a digital copy of the original negative, but a transfer of the raw material from the analog to the digital world, a process which cannot be done without special skills, since the negatives must be interpreted, for instance in terms of sharpness, contrast or mood, to create a new master file that in the end can replace the analog negative. Within the workflow of digitization, the negatives are also repackaged and rearranged so that they can easily be found again. For the storage, presentation and distribution of the digital master files, we collaborate with the most important technical university of Switzerland, the Federal Polytechnical Institute in Zurich. Fortunately, we can use their servers, which helps us keep the cost for infrastructure relatively low. To date, we have uploaded around 27,000 images to this database, which can be researched publicly and ordered online. But in parallel to this basic work, however, the Photosystem continues to produce exhibitions and publications. Every project gives us a new opportunity to deepen our knowledge about the archives we have taken over and to combine the archival work with the curatorial work. When dealing with physical objects in the exhibition space, it becomes obvious that photographs are much more than documentary information. They become elements of a narrative which gives them a specific meaning, a meaning that sometimes has little to do with the historical content of the image. Finally, thanks to its exhibitions, the Photosystem is also in a position to participate in the world of contemporary photography and in contact with today's photographers to observe its development. This is important because it enables us to get an idea of what archives of the future will look like, but also because we can enter into an international dialogue with such projects. We always have a few exhibitions touring internationally. Here is an example of a project we realized in China last year, combining 5 Swiss and 5 Chinese artists who are concentrating on different forms of photographic storytelling. In relation to all these activities and the masses of images in our depots, however, we are still a small institution. Around 7 people from the core team are responsible for managing the growing collection, securing and organizing the archives, lending works to other museums, digitizing, administering the database, and producing exhibitions and publications. But let me turn back to the question, how can we reactivate archives? My case studies focus on 4 individual archives and archive holdings in our foundation. They deal with collective memory, the other side of history, or the gaps in the archive, the question of national and cultural identity, and the question of truth in a photographic document. The first example concerns a relatively unknown Swiss photographer called Emil Brunner. In his case, we really hesitated if we should take the archive or not. Emil Brunner, you see him here, top left, was a very prolific press photographer who made excursions to every possible country in the world and published his travel reports in magazines and newspapers. His reportages are of average quality, nothing outstanding. Pictures that can be found in dozens of estates of his generation. When Emil Brunner died in 1995, he left behind such a large and poorly organized archive that we were overwhelmed by the abundance of material. Nevertheless, we finally decided to take the archive and preserve it. The crucial factor was the discovery of a series of images from 1943-44, which Emil Brunner had kept in a separate box under the name Mountain Kids. These were about 1,700 black and white photographs taken by the photographer in a small number of villages of one single valley in the Swiss Alps. Almost all the negatives showed children and adolescents, a whole generation, so to speak. In most cases, they lacked names or other information. We don't know much about the intention of the photographer. Some postcards that he made from his pictures suggest that he had perhaps hoped to earn some money with producing postcards. What is special about these portraits, however, is their highly consistent form. All children are photographed directly and frontally, in the square format of the Rolleiflex camera, always from the same distance. The photographer had a great sensitivity for lighting and, with precise shots, achieved a formal unity that today we would label as serial and as straight photography. Emil Brunner thus created a kind of visual inventory of all the children of that specific valley, almost like in a contemporary art project. He shed light on a microcosm as if he had a sociological concept in mind. The potential of these 1,700 mountain kids was obvious. This unique series justified to bring the whole archive into our foundation. After the takeover, we immediately began to work on this part of the archive in order to produce a book and an exhibition. But how should we deal with them? Should we try to identify as many children as possible and document them with biographical, geographical, or historical information? We chose a different approach. Instead of the almost hopeless attempt to do justice to 1,700 individual life stories, we limited ourselves to around 30 children who are still alive today and could easily be found. 60 years after they had been photographed, they told their memories in detailed interviews. Their narratives were recorded and inserted into a text montage in which, so to speak, the individual remembrance merges with the collective memory of an entire generation. The goal was not an objective or authentic account of history. Rather, the images were triggers for narratives from today's perspective, and as we know, such memories are marked by distortions, projections, and transformations of the truth. Memories are always full of inventions and fictions, and exactly for this reason they are exciting. So this way of contextualizing images also produces fictional elements. And I believe the result has as much to do with our present as with the past. What fascinates us today in those pictures, and this is also expressed in the narratives we recorded, is the contrast of being a child today. Not only in the clothes, but also in the looks and faces. We encounter people who are not yet used to posing in front of the camera. We see attitudes and facial expressions that do not attempt to imitate media novels. And in the memories that we collected, some kind of a shock about this change in everyday life is expressed. For this project, we produced a simple slideshow from which I would like to present you a small sequence. And even if you don't understand the German language, I think you can feel the power of the contemplation, of the combination of text and image.
Erst im Juni, mit steigenden Temperaturen, zeigte die Krankheit ihr grauenhaftes, wahres Gesicht. Als die ersten Kinder buchstäblich zusammenbrachen und nicht mehr laufen konnten, alarmierte man den Arzt. Jetzt ging es wie das Aufflackern eines mordenden Feuers durch das Dorf. Am 15. Juni trug man meinen Bruder aus dem Maiensells ins Dorf. Er starb am 19. Juni. Mich brachte man am 17. Juni herunter. Ich kam sofort ins Spital. Dort war ich zusammen mit einem anderen Mädchen gänzlich abgesondert. Schwester Pia, eine herzensgute Nonne, betreute uns. Sie musste sich immer umziehen, wenn sie zu uns kam. Man machte nicht viel mit uns. Medikamente bekamen wir keine. Dafür wurden wir verwöhnt mit Spielsachen, Schokolade, Orangen und anderen Geschenken. Eigentlich hatte ich es noch nie so schön gehabt. Ich war damals 9 Jahre alt. Mein rechter Arm und meine Beine waren gelähmt.
Meine Großeltern väterlicherseits starben beide am gleichen Tag, obwohl ich für sie feine Biskuits gekauft hatte. In der Stube standen 2 Särge mit roten Blumen geschmückt. Viele weinende und traurige Menschen hatten sich eingefunden. Auch Urgroßvater war schon gestorben. Ich hoffte, es putze ihm im Himmel jemand die Schuhe. Er hatte sich nicht mehr gut bücken können. Ich hatte ihm oft die Schuhe geputzt, mit schwarzer Schuhwichse und einer kleinen Bürste. Die anderen meinten, ich könne es nicht.
So, sorry. I think this is enough just to give you the impression what it is about. It's there are 2 actors reading the memories of the children or the grown-up children, and this is the way how we transform this memory into a new narrative. So, let me come to the second case, which has a completely different background. A few years ago, when I was looking for photographs from the First World War in our collection, I noticed a big gap. For the years 1940 to 1918, we had very few pictures, and what we owned was hardly representative. During my research, I came across so-called photographic postcards. These are not the normal mass-produced offset print postcards we know today. They are original silver gelatin prints that were produced in small editions on photographic paper and then used as postcards. On the back of each one of these postcards is a short text from the sender. The photographs were often produced by unknown amateurs, and even today, it is still possible to find them in private households where they are kept in the families of the recipients. No public institution had systematically collected them. With some effort, we were able to collect over 1,000 photo postcards from the period 1914 to 1918 and bring them into a certain order. It turned out that they were probably one of the most important and most popular means of visual communication at that time. Thousands of them were sent every day from the soldiers in the army to their families at home. Most interestingly, these photographs show the period of the First World War from a totally different angle than what the official press or photographers did. They don't celebrate the great historical events of wartime, but show everyday scenes. Quite often they present humorous performances, weird games and sociable events in leisure time. This does not mean, however, that the soldiers experienced their military service as a holiday camp. The meaning of the images goes far beyond the visible. What did the soldiers actually want to tell their families at home? Looking at the whole collection, one quickly realizes that their photo postcards were not meant to represent the truth. Rather, they served as a kind of sedative. Like the short texts on the back, the pictures say, "I'm fine, you don't have to worry. We even have time for fun and games." Probably they are the antidote against the boring and frustrating reality in the army. They try to make sense in a war that seemed absurd to many soldiers and separated them from their own families from normal life. Again, the question is, how can we reactivate such an archive of photo postcards? And here I deliberately use the term archive in a broad sense. How can we make them speak to us today? In order to explore the more symbolical, emotional and iconographic content of these photographs, we made a film. We invited a literary critic, a historian, a photography expert and the curator to gather around a large table which was covered with around 1,000 original photo postcards. Thus, the film camera recorded an intense conversation and literally different approaches from many angles. The subjective point of view and the spontaneous sensations played an important role in analyzing the pictures. The conversation went forth and back between the hard facts of history and the soft human layer to which the observers reacted in search of meaning on a deeper level. In the post-production of the film, the discussion was illustrated with the corresponding images, and the camera zoomed into the details that are hardly noticed when we look at the whole photograph. In this way, we also wanted to avoid that the photographs would merely serve as evidence for already existing historical knowledge. Their potential does not lie in the confirmation of facts, but on the unconscious emotional level on which images from that time challenge us. We look into a face and the face looks back. Thus, photography can unfold its power over time. In my third case, I would like to focus on the relationship between photography and identity. Photo archives related to a specific geographical territory are an important source when it comes to the question of national and cultural identity. Since the 19th century, photography has been used to shape the iconography of nations. photographs help to build our collective memory. The representation of significant events in the history of a nation is part of a national narrative, and photographs seem to provide evidence so that this narrative is connected with reality. But at the same time, photography has a tendency to stereotype certain landscapes and social rituals and give them a mythical dimension. They create a collective vision of the world that is not to be confused with reality. We may call this a social construction of reality, a narrative that produces a sense of togetherness and identity. Photographs play an eminent role in this kind of narrative, since they can link the present with the past and bring absent people and things into presence. According to the British anthropologist Elizabeth Edwards, quote, "Photographs function as the connective tissue of a nation," unquote. But Elizabeth Edwards describes the archive also as a space of negotiation, as the idea of nation is constantly renegotiated. In this respect, the archive represents shifting rhetorics of what people believe about themselves in relation to others, as photographs slip in and out of discourses of the nation and identity. Thus, we must be aware of the fact that we cannot avoid ideological filters. Collecting photographs for an archive is not a neutral procedure, and working with archives is always motivated by particular intentions that influence our perception. Let me explain this with the archive of the photographer Teo Friday. Between 1930 and 1950, Teo Friday realized a large number of social reportage for the press in Switzerland. His documentary style is similar to that of American FSA photography. He tried to draw the public's attention to social and political problems, to the dark sides of society that nobody wanted to see. Within his archive, there is an interesting body of work called 12 Communities, created just before the Second World War. The negatives and contact sheets have almost completely survived. This picture shows some of the contact sheets, which look like this. Each cardboard box contains contact sheets of this kind. Teo Friday's concept was simple. He carefully selected 12 communities in different regions of Switzerland, which he documented in detail. His aim was to show the diversity, but also the peculiarity of local cultures. Thus, he photographed people at work, in their leisure time, at meetings, or during everyday activities. He recorded the living conditions marked by landscape and topography, and he studied the economic foundations of each region. His photographs were exhibited at the Swiss National Exhibition of 1939. But in fact, this work had a clear mission. When Teo Friday proposed this project, Europe was on the brink of war. Switzerland saw itself threatened by Nazi Germany under Hitler. During this time, the country prepared itself for war, not only with the army, but also morally and ideologically. We call this the national spiritual defense. The national exhibition itself was a demonstration for the independence of Switzerland, and it was organized to strengthen the resistance against Nazi Germany, and photography was crucial for this campaign. Exactly as Elizabeth Edwards describes it, it provided the connective tissue of the nation. In that period, the diversity of cultures and local traditions were an extremely important theme to emphasize Switzerland's otherness. With the help of images like those of Teo Friday, the country was able to construct and shape its identity and to give visual evidence that its democratic system was invented centuries ago. Naturally, this is a myth, but it looked like a truth looking at the photographs. Seen in this light, the photographs reveal a meaning that clearly goes beyond a series of photojournalistic portraits of various communities. They become part of a political manifesto of an entire generation. 2 years ago, we initiated a new project in order to explore how much the significance of these photographs is determined by their historical context. Shane Lavalette, a young American photographer, was commissioned to work on the archive of Teo Friday with a fresh approach. He used these images and the archive as raw material for his own new narrative. In the year 2017, he visited the same 12 villages that Teo Friday had chosen 70 years earlier. He was inspired by the historical work without using the photographs for a crude comparison. He did not juxtapose the past and the present. That would have been much too simple. Instead, he took up the fine poetry of his predecessor, his love of detail and simple everyday things. On this lyrical level, he managed to interweave past and present in a natural way. The following series of pictures is like a dreamlike flow of images in which the factual information seems to lose its importance. And it's easy to distinguish the historical and the present photographs. And still they stay connected. As a result of Shane's project, we experienced this interconnection between yesterday and today. The images of Teo Friday do not stand any longer for the political uniqueness of Switzerland, but in a more general sense, for the fascinating continuity of time, the longue durée, even in a world that has changed dramatically in the last 70 years. In my last example, I would like to present the archive of Walter Bossard and discuss the truth of photographic images on an individual level. Walter Bossard was a Swiss photographer and a journalist who worked as a freelancer in Asia between 1930 and 1940, producing reportage for major European and American magazines. His archive consists of around 25,000 negatives and very few vintage prints. Quite a large number of his writings, manuscripts, diaries also survived, but unfortunately most of these written documents are not part of his photographic estate, and they are dispersed in various other institutions. For this reason, it is not easy to link the images from our archive to the written documents. About 20 years ago, we already worked with Walter Bossard's negatives for the first time, and we presented his work in an exhibition and a publication. The focus at that time was on his great travels and expeditions. We showed him above all as an explorer and adventurer, and positioned his work in the tradition of travel photography. Only recently, when a Chinese curator visited the archive, I had the chance to see his work from a totally different perspective. Looking at this archive from the Chinese side, Walter Bossart turned out to be one of the most important correspondents to cover the war between Japan and China in the 1930s. Like no one else, he had access to the most influential persons on all sides of this complicated struggle for supremacy in Asia. And he followed all the developments over a whole decade. In order to find out more about the significance of his photographs, we organized exhibitions in China, which was shown in various cities. Each time it was very well received by the audience. One of the most interesting experiences, though, was how much these historical photographs were still politically explosive, and that emotions went high among the visitors. What was the reason for this? Walter Bossart saw himself as a neutral reporter. He attempted not only to shed light on the Japanese war against China from a single perspective, but also to consider the various parties and interests. He not only visited the Chinese front, but also spoke to the Japanese generals. He not only observed the nationalists in their war preparations, but also photographed the communists who, under Mao's leadership, built up the resistance. However, Bossart's pictures and texts show that the history of the anti-Japanese war was different from what the Chinese school children learned in their history books today. The crucial and still controversially discussed part of the exhibition was the roles of the communist and the nationalist army in fighting the Japanese. Bossart's images lead us to a different view of history. Therefore, it is not surprising that the exhibition of Walter Bossart's photographs in Shanghai, for example, had to be reduced by almost 1/3. The pictures obviously contradicted the official narrative. The fact that some 80-year-old pictures proved to be so delicate motivated me to extend the research in the Walter Bossart archive and to look at it anew. In fact, the Chinese reaction to this work had opened our eyes for the relevant questions. Based on the originally published reports, for example, we found a lot of additional information for the significance of his photographs in the 1930s. Further documents of his work, such as contact sheets, helped us better understand their background. Luckily, we also succeeded in finding many vintage prints in a press archive in Germany, which, thanks to their captions on the reverse, contain highly interesting information in the individual pictures. Thus, we were able to situate the images in their original media context. And on this basis, we edited many images that had been overlooked before. Of course, modern technology also offered new possibilities thanks to the improved digitization. We can now digitize the negatives in an extremely high quality and work with them as the photographer himself would have done in his darkroom. Here, some of the images we edited for the first time. Bossart probably never saw them as prints. So the same archive that we once used to present as the work of a traveling photographer was used to present him as a war photographer. However, as in the previous cases, one has to ask, how these photographs relate to historical reality. Can we consider them as true, authentic documents? What kind of truth can we expect? From Walter Bossard we know that he wanted to provide objective information to the best of his knowledge and belief. As mentioned before, his reportage attempted to convey the views of the various parties in a complex historical situation. And yet, as an independent freelancer, he too was under pressure to sell his stories, like all photojournalists. The stories had to be told in an exciting or dramatic way, so that they attracted the attention of the editors and the readers. And the pictures had to present themselves as authentic as possible. I would like to pick out one example. This photograph by Walter Bossard shows a Chinese woman in Hankou in 1938 after a Japanese air raid. The photographer seems to have discovered the scene by accident. It is an impressive testimony of the Japanese rage and the despair of the Chinese population, and it looks as if captured spontaneously. But what is this woman doing on the ruins? Why is she sitting there? What is she waiting for? Did the photographer meet her alone? Will she continue to sit on the ruins afterwards, traumatized and petrified by the horrors of war? Without further information, we tend to this conclusion. However, while researching for our exhibition, I came across a second photograph in another archive, the Black Star Archive in Canada, that was also taken by Walter Bossard shortly before or after the first one. It shows another photographer giving instructions to the same woman. The photographer seems to tell her what posture she has to take and in which direction to look. He probably wants the shadow of the umbrella to fall just right and give the blinded face a calm black background, so that the face itself becomes the center of the picture and remains detached from the surrounding ruins. Obviously, her face was exposed to the sun for formal and photographic reasons. But how far did the photographer go? Did he perhaps also tell the woman to look into the camera as desperately as possible? This making of photograph puzzled me when I saw it first. Bossard's second picture raises questions about his first picture too. Did Walter Bossard in his first image also interfere before photographing the woman? This same Walter Bossard who once said, "Photography doesn't lie." And if it is true that this scene was staged, is it just a harmless intervention in favor of the aesthetical quality of photography? Or do we have to conclude that the whole scene is an invention? But why did Bossard take a second picture at all? A picture that shows his professional colleague in a rather critical situation. A situation that brings up doubts about the authenticity of his own picture. Did Bossard consider it normal to arrange such a scene? Nobody can answer these questions anymore. We depend on speculations. But at least they remind us once more that the documentary claim of photograph has its limits. Something we all know but tend to forget. In most cases, we lack the information to measure the influence of a photographer on the representation of reality. I'm not talking about obvious manipulations. I'm talking about the soft factors like the choice of angle and perspective, or the subjective framing and cropping of a fragment of reality. So, what about the truth of this image? Does Walter Bossart's first shot lose its credibility with his second image? My answer would be no. If we acknowledge that photographs can never convey more than subjective messages, we must not reduce the term credibility to a single image and its supposed authenticity. Even the most documentary photograph contains elements of fiction, or at least we produce the fictional part in our heads when reading the image. However, this does not diminish its potential to tell the truth. A novel can be just as true as a documentary report. In Walter Bossart's case, the truth of the image might lie in the desperate expression of the woman, and not so much in the pure authenticity of the photographed scene. With this understanding of photography, he probably allowed himself to take staged photographs, if necessary, even in a journalistic context. And when he did it, he didn't hide it. In 1938, for instance, Walter Bossart took this photograph of a soldier hit by a bullet. But he declared that it was staged, and it was obvious too, because it was part of a fictional story about the Chinese peasant Chan who enrolled in the army. 2 years earlier, in 1936, Robert Capa had taken his famous photograph of another falling soldier during the Spanish Civil War, but he never declared that it was staged. So, how can we measure the truth of both images? A difficult question. Robert Frank once wrote the beautiful sentence, "The truth is somewhere between the documentary and the fictional." And that is what I try to show. What is real one moment has become imaginary in the next. Especially with so-called photographic documents of the past, facts and fiction cannot be sharply separated, and the truth of an image cannot be measured solely by its factual content. This is even more the case when we try to understand entire archives. It would be wrong to believe that a photo archive is a container of facts which have been fixed in pictures. The individual photographs themselves are already interpretations of reality, as we all know. And on top of this, the way they are organized in the archive gives them a meaning beyond pure documentation. If we then arrange the photographs in a sequence for a book or in an exhibition, we come close to what a historian does when he combines a series of facts into a logically coherent narrative. We too try to weave these small photographic fragments into a meaningful whole, but we should always be aware that we are not only telling stories, not only telling history, but also stories. These stories are just as much narrations about our present world, than about the past. Just to be clear, I do not want to deny the documentary power of photo archives. The visual documentation of reality and the recording of our present and the past is certainly a necessity and an extremely important way to resist the manipulation of truth, as it happens more and more. With my 4 examples, I simply wanted to show that archives and reality are related to each other in a very complex way. It is a relation that changes constantly. The same archive can be read in completely diverse directions at different times. An archive is never objective, and it certainly does not contain the truth. But, to say it positively, photo archives are an inexhaustible source for historical research and for creating narratives of today, for documenting the past and for fiction. We need photo archives for telling stories, true stories. Thank you so much.
So we'll take some questions. Thanks, Peter. I have one question. When we talk about collective memory, I'm just trying to see where we also have a space which can make collective authorship, because the agency of archive is also very important to see when especially archive is theorized and institutionalized by expert reading, specialized view. So people who contribute to that, how come they don't only contribute with photographs, but they also contribute through stories, because we are trying to see lyrical quality of work, we are trying to see mythical quality of work, and fictional aspect of it. And of course, mass have their own take on this archive too. And this will also relate to the panel discussion we'll have this afternoon, because in this edition we are showing an archive from varied areas, but there is a Kashmir archive which is very sensitive, politically sensitive, and it actually needs to talk about the authorship too of who are these people and how they are treating this archive, or is it really safe for them to be represented in a certain way? So that is my question, how can an institution facilitate collective authorship and keep the space open for the normal people to contribute with their own mythical views?
I think you mentioned it already. We cannot only talk about the images. Very, very loud now. Is it okay? Archives are full of different kinds of documents, and building the context of images, which is part of the mission of archives, I suppose, is to preserve the perspective of the authors, of the contributors to the archive. So it's a question of context, of contextualization of images, and that's what archive can do. I think, I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I mean the question how to preserve the authorship goes beyond the image, no?
Yeah, and also how to engage the contributor of images in this sort of conversations or this sort of information when we are actually trying to see it from a very interesting philosophical point of view and theoretical point of view. Is vernacular have space to add or contribute to the theory itself sometimes, because as you say, it's very subjective and space specific, culture specific. All right, is there any other question?
Thank you, Peter. That was fascinating. I'm still trying to, I think, grapple with the question about where to draw the line between the qualitative aspect of an archive and the quantitative aspect of an archive. I mean, is the more you have, is that better? Because obviously the more you can plumb, the more you can look at. Or is it that the more you can categorize and bring up to the surface as really the true representation of an event? Is that better? How do you draw that line in your own mind when you're looking at an archive, that qualitative and the quantitative boundaries?
I think maintaining an archive is something like a dialectical process. You need both. For me, it's like you have the unconscious part and the conscious part, and they are connected. The unconscious part, also in our archive, is the part we can never really work on because we have too much. We have archives that contain like 100,000 negatives, and we can never cope with it. So this stays sort of sleeping in a way and waiting till we have the right questions. So it's not, I mean, the masses can be a problem, just storage and so on, but at the same time, I believe that keeping this unconscious part is also the potential of archives, because this part allows future generations to have new interpretations, new stories, new narratives, and you need it. I have problems with the kind of archive that tries to categorize everything at one moment, because then you have only the vision of your time, of your moment, and that sort of kills the potential of the archive.
I wanted to ask you about some of the administrative modalities of collection, management, and acquisition at the museum. Is it very geared towards the collection of the world cultures of photography? Is there a mandate to look at regions such as South Asia or the subcontinent? I know the exhibition that you recently did on the works of Bossard and Gandhi and so on was fascinating, but is there an interest, a larger interest in this more local vernacular culture of photography? And sort of how do you, at what points of time do you make an acquisition for the museum? Is it something that is consistently done? Is there a mission statement? What are the ideological underpinnings of the acquisitions that are made by the museum, and sort of where does it settle within the global north, the global south, and so on?
As I explained, our institution is in the role of a national heritage institution. We get subsidies from the Swiss Confederation for what we're doing, and this is linked with a focus on photography related to Switzerland. But at the same time, I try to take every opportunity to open it up, because this is also what I wanted to show with the case of Waterfoss, the perspective from the other side, the transfer of this archival view into a different cultural context helps us so much to understand the archive, to understand the logics of the archive. Otherwise, you stay in your very small world, and it's not easy to find these links all the time, because we have masses of photographs related to Switzerland, so it's not easy to bring it out, but you always find some kind of bridges, and that's what makes it interesting. So, I think I said we don't buy archives, we have them, we get donations. I try not to buy them, except if there is no other way to secure something. But when we take over an archive, we try to buy a couple of works from the photographer, because we don't just want to take everything. It's some kind of an exchange. We don't buy archives because we don't believe in the material, valorization of the archive. It's so difficult because there is no market. How much would you pay for an archive? And if you start this process, it becomes very, very complicated. So the question of acquisition, we try to build context with the acquisitions. And there too, we are sort of, we have a special focus on Switzerland, but we also try to open up. If there is some kind of relation to other works, which, for instance, in the case of Waterfoss, which helps us to understand the archive, we would be open for acquisition. So I think one important thing for reading archives, for understanding archives, is the shift of perspectives in any sense. I mean, there can be shift of time, shift of culture. That's what I can say about that.
All right. So we'll just take one more question.
Thank you very much. This is about the Shanghai exhibition. Obviously, to exhibit in Shanghai would give you and your organization something back. But you also said that you had to leave out 1/3 of what you exhibited. How do you where do you draw kind of the ethical border of where you say, if they had said you can only show, I don't know, 20% of what you want to show, then you say, well, then we're not going to show it at all.
Yes. As long as the narrative can be told, in this case, I would accept the situation, although it was difficult. But what happened in Shanghai was that all the visitors were conscious about the fact that there was censorship. And there was a way of communicating about this. So the message comes through even without all the images. And in fact, the process was that this exhibition and the censorship created more attention as it is always, like censorship is stupid because it's sort of creates more attention, and that happened as well. So this exhibition was quite well reviewed and discussed, and in social media was very present. And the result is that we have another exhibition now, planning one for this year, a large exhibition in Beijing. And I think it's part of this effect. So it was a strategic decision to say, okay, we accept censorship at a certain level, but we have some progress afterwards.
All right. Thanks, Peter.